There's something about the PS3 Ratchet & Clank games that just doesn't sit quite right with me. Sorry, the Ratchet & Clank Future games, how could I forget? The games have a different fundamental feel to them compared to those of the PS2. A bad feel? Hard to say, really. These aren't bad games, far from them. But this is where the series really starts to crumble under an identity crisis, and I can't help but wonder if Up Your Arsenal is to blame. 2 quick notes before we hit the artery. First, like in the PS2 video, spoilers are ahead for all the games discussed, so, watch out for that. Spot them all and win a fabulous prize. Secondly, I want to apologize in advance for the quality of the A Crack in Time footage, or the lack thereof, rather. I don't own my original copy anymore, and since all other copies of the game are apparently lost in the city of El Dorado, the most cost-sensitive way I could play was streaming it through PlayStation Now. The experience was actually a lot smoother than I expected it to be, and the footage doesn't look too bad, but it might come off a bit chunky at times compared to the other games shown off. I have but the one apology to offer, so please share amongst yourselves. But accept it or don't, high time to start talking about these cheeky little crumpets. Last time I talked at length at how the first couple of Ratchet games were able blends of platforming and combat, founded on exploration of vast and varied galaxies that are unified by overbearing consumerism and the self-absorption arising from such. Up Your Arsenal is and wasn't that, but not entirely on purpose. Well documentedly, the game was rushed out the door, which left it a much more linear combat-focused game with a more cut-and-dry narrative that filled in the gaps with LOL random jokes. It was essentially half the Ratchet experience, but it also was and still is the most critically successful game in the series despite this. And one can't help but wonder if Insomniac Games couldn't help but wonder, are we trying too hard? I mean, why else for these future games would we be back to fixed momentum strafe jumping and linear levels, just like Up Your Arsenal? Why else would the future games' plots be more concerned with loosely threading along jokes than leading up to any more provocative a point? Now, let me back up for a second. What I'm going to talk about today, I don't want it to sound like I'm climbing atop my highest brow, all like, Ratchet & Clank used to be such a sophisticated satire of consumer society. If only they hadn't gone and dumbed it down for the peons. Look at what these games title themselves. These are not sophisticated games. Truthfully, even the best Ratchet games aren't particularly deep, but they are consistent. You look at a conversation with an NPC, or a gameplay mechanic like buying weapons, all these different aspects of a game, you can trace it back to the same underlying themes. The games have deeper meanings. And not being about consumerism and the stuff the other games were about is fine. We're 5 games in, hell to the yes, we should be doing new things. The problem is, the Ratchet series has never put together a solid identity after losing the consumerism bend. Games like Up Your Arsenal, these future games, there's no between the lines. Robot space pirates, fluffy critters piloting murder machines, death by disco, all of these things in the future series, they're not part of any bigger picture. They're their own jokes waiting for a punchline and a laugh track. When the villains are all treated like big goofs, none of them feel like actual threats representing any more abstract danger. All this attempt at generic mythology thrown into the mix, turns out Ratchet's the last of a super special species that saved the universe, and Clank's actually mystical keeper of all time, just doesn't land right 5 games in when it's not founded on anything from previous games. Quite the opposite, in fact, but more on that later. You could wheedle some broad concepts out from the future games, especially A Crack in Time, like heritage or friendship and leaving the past where it is, but it's all surface level, and all things we've seen done so many times in so many other places. It's all parts and pieces, individual moments. There's no character. I've said it once, I've said it twice, I'll say it 1,000 flippin' times. The galaxies in the original Ratchet games used to feel like characters in their own right, because of the themes that underlaid the narratives and how we would see them reflected in the places we'd visit and in the characters with whom we'd speak. When planets only serve as stepping stones towards the end of a narrow hero plot, when we're stuck with only a small cast of maybe 7 characters we see everywhere, there's no real sense of scale. This isn't hard. Hell, A Crack in Time comes really close with a slew of various alien NPCs. It just doesn't hit the mark when there's no interconnectivity between them to make them feel like part of the same galaxy. Ratchet barely even talks to them, and when he does, it's through voiceless dialogue options. The only interactions we get are with the characters that matter. Every planet's just a new backdrop for the next scene of the Save the Day play. Like, name 5 planets from the future games right now. Do it, right now. I only remember Jacindu because of that stupid boss that makes you do the grind rails again if you die, cause this level is an ass. All Ratchet games have been hero save the day stories when you break them down, but the best give it meaning more than that. Breaking the cycle of endangering lives for a profit, toppling a corrupt media empire. The future games take away that layer, and in its place they push this generic last-of-his-kind lore. You know what would make this character so much more interesting? Divine birthright! I don't know what up-and-coming hotshot writer needs to hear this, but tacking things on to your character's backstory does not make them more interesting. Giving Ratchet a Goku Son of Krypton origin story doesn't do anything but put most of the storytelling in past tense, as we explain why, no really, he's so cool, you guys. The hard truth is that Ratchet's family life has never really been a concern to neither him nor us. He can be curious, sure, by all means, but when this last of his race shtick becomes the sole basis of his character, and that he decides to drop everything and everyone at the chance to save the Lombaxes, it doesn't feel genuine. It's not an evolution of his character, it's not even a new spin on it. He's as empty a non-entity as he's ever been. And Clank, I don't even think Clank verbally acknowledges the whole Mystic Timekeeper thing outside of the one time. He doesn't even throw out a non-committal, that's cool. He's just so casually like, well, this is my backstory now. And that's the big deal to me. How completely detached from previous games these new plots feel, thematically, character-wise, all of it. It all feels like it's trying to invent new reasons to care about the characters rather than building on what's there. They don't explain anything in greater detail, they don't recontextualize anything in a way that actually affects our understanding of the previous games. As a matter of fact, it feels like there's a conscious effort to ignore previous games. Ratchet is the last of his species, that's why we've never seen any Lombaxes in the game before, you see? Except we did, very prominently, in Going Commando. Angela Cross. Major character. One of the most important characters in that game, actually. Guess what? Lombax. Right there. Other Lombax. What was even the thought process here? Like, think about this. Tools of Destruction released 4 years after Going Commando. Literally a shorter gap than there's been between the 2016 reboot and Rift Apart in 2021. 4 years! And they just decide, yeah, no one will notice if we completely retcon out a prominent character from one of our most celebrated games. Like, if that doesn't tip you off as to the attitudes going into this game, I don't know what will. We're literally pretending previous games didn't exist to make this generic new tat work. And I know, they clumsily retcon it further in A Crack in Time by mentioning Angela actually got saved by Cool Hand McSpace Dude or whatever.
Lombax rebel Angela Cross has been missing for almost 3 years. She was a victim of former dictator Percival Tachyon's vendetta against the Lombaxes, and was last seen fleeing the Cerulean sector in Max Apogee's starship.
But that is still so friggin' weak. Ratchet knew Angela. Ratchet interacted with Angela. He doesn't mention her once this entire sub-series.
So you're a Lombax who's never seen another Lombax.
What, is Angela bullying him and he's too scared to talk about her? And I know, I am not the first person to bring this up, or even the 50th, millionth, but I feel like I'm the only one who's mad enough about it. I just don't get it. Why not include Angela in the story, make her part of this? Why just ignore her? No guys, come on, we remember Angela, totally. Look, she's even got her own paint job named after her for the Constructo Bomb glove. Pink and white, it's her colors. What do you mean those colors aren't associated with her at all? I thought you said she was a girl. How tasteless can you get? Meanwhile, I don't even know what to make of Clank's Time Lord thing he's got going on. I feel like I need to comment on it, but, what do I say? What even is it? It's barely about Clank. He's basically his own plotline's middleman between this thing and Nefarious. He arguably has lost more character in these games than Ratchet has. Here's the thing, though. I could maybe go for one. Preferably Clank, cause, yeah, kinda weird for a reject Warbot model to be 1/10 the scale of the regular with no firepower whatsoever. Probably fine with that being retconned into some Chosen One thing. But when you're telling me that the last of a race that saved the universe and the super important prophesized keeper of time just accidentally crash-landed on the same planet and became the bestest buds in the universe, that's when I turn into Jeff Goldblum deciding whether or not to accept another piece of cake. You see, finds a way, See, the problem isn't doing this whole Chosen One thing for either or Ratchet and Clank. The problem is that I'm not convinced any of it matters. It just feels like such contrivance. Even if we play along and pretend Angela never existed until we're called out for it like Insomniac was, what's the end goal here? How does this lore make any of these characters more interesting? Maybe I'm alone in thinking this, but I always thought that Ratchet being some guy just made him so much more appealing. Like, it could have been anyone, didn't matter who or what he was, it just happened to be him, and now look at him. From selfish nobody to hero for the ages. But now it turns out that he was always some cool guy, just shy of being outright prophesized to save the universe. Clank's not some innocent eye thrust into the deep end of greed, proof that goodwill will always prevail. Now he's some star child birthed in glorious purpose to keep order in the universe. Even the plumber isn't safe. Instead of just some relatable, cynical working Joe making his buck in an economically unequal galaxy, now he's like the Watcher for this universe or something? Knows everything that has ever happened and will ever happen? The word really is relatable, isn't it? All this bullshit, chosen ones and space prophecies, this isn't life. This isn't what happens in life. Ratchet & Clank has always been sci-fi, but its world and characters were always rooted in real-world values and attitudes. There's nothing real about the future games. Being sci-fi was never the point of early Ratchet games, but with the future games, that's all they have going. I can't imagine anyone getting attached to the series through these games as their introduction. What would even stand out to those people? The main characters with no personality or development? The villain whose crown is too big for he head? Mr. Zircon?
Our friends!
Why can't Mr. Zircon not shoot? Why can Mr. Zircon not shoot little fuckboys? Stupid fuckboy. Why can't Mr. Zircon not kill? Mr. Zircon is bored.
If you were to take out the context of the previous games, all you're left with is done-to-death tropes and a zonkers mythology wrapped up in plots that aren't even consistent with themselves.
Only two stay behind. The Keeper of the Dimensionator and his infant son.
Well, then what about this Joker?
We were approached by an inventor with incredible ideas.
But I thought they said,
Percival Tachyon, discovered by Lombax trillium miners eons after the war, and raised on Fastum.
Wait, Tachyon was raised by Lombaxes?
and then he said,
Even have the scruples to give you a name.
but then he said,
Only I know your true purpose in this galaxy. Only I know your true name.
and why is it, again, that the Zoni decide to only show up to Clank for all of Tools of Destruction just to say sod it for the rest of the games? Dumb drama?
The Zonies say Talwyn is in trouble.
You know, Clank, just once, I wish you'd listen to your real friends instead of your imaginary ones.
Are we literally so devoted to following templates that we can't stop for literally a second and think about why we're doing what we're doing? I think the thing that really sums up the future sub-series is the run to the litter, Quest for Booty. The completely serious, dramatic climax of the game's story is centered around the ghosts of robot pirates. Something that was a joke in Up Your Arsenal. Like, literally word for word.
No previous adventure could have prepared Quark for his encounter with the dread pirate Blackstar and his crew of... Oh, please tell me this is a typo.
That's robotic pirate ghosts.
I mean, I've worked on some real junk, but this one takes the cake. Pirate, ghosty robots. I mean, what do they think, we're idiots?
At this point, this series has become its own punchline. It's kinda sad, honestly. Just completely lose all self-awareness. To become so insecure, you end up becoming the exact kind of overproduced, over-sensationalized culture you yourself once ridiculed. The first games didn't even have a writing team, yet they show a better understanding of narrative and characters, of heart and soul. More so, at least, than these hollow shells. Now, are these stories ultimately bad? Not really, not in a basic definition. Are these games completely devoid of solid moments? Not at all. In fact, the last half an hour or so of A Crack in Time comes incredibly close to being really great. But even the best moments of these games are let down when they feel like they exist by themselves instead of emblems of actually good storytelling. We want the ending of A Crack in Time to be legendary because that's what it should be. That's what it could be. But that near greatness doesn't come from the trilogy it's capping off, it comes from this idea of the series as a whole. I feel like when thinking about A Crack in Time's ending, my mind automatically jumps over everything from the PS3 era up to that point, cause seriously, what did it add? This ending could have rolled with the particulars changed around right after the PS2 saga ended with much of the same emotional impact intact. Imagine if the space had actually been filled with content that felt like it truly embraced the duo's past experiences, explored the relationship even further, actually built up instead of swapped out. Without any of that, these stories are, ultimately, basic, bottom-line competent sci-fi fare. What's most disappointing is how much more they could have been. You can't expect to grow if you keep cutting away the roots. I really don't have much to say about the gameplay in these future games. Honestly, it's just more of what came before. Same old blend of platforming and shooting, but still invariably leaning towards the latter, and unfortunately with the same focus on linearity as Up Your Arsenal. Going even further, actually, to the point at which every level is one big glorified corridor. And hip hip hooray! We've regressed back to stiff strafe jumping, awkward damage scaling, and the anti-fun weapon leveling system, which basically serves as a conveyor belt taking a weapon from usefulness all the way down to the trash bin. All of this stuff is basically intact from the PS2 era, just with all the weapon names switched around each time, and about 20 tons more bloom and particle effects. Like, holy hell, can I see, please? In terms of what each game adds to the formula, which admittedly isn't much, Tools of Destruction throws in a new weapon category called Devices, which are ostensibly more tactical than conventional weapons, but functionally they're pretty much just weapons, but considering how they don't level up and how their ammo is pretty damn rare and or expensive for how weak they can be, they don't feel all that useful. Since the game was a launch window title for the PS3, it's also chock full of 6-axis motion control bits. Wow! Each of which manages to be more annoying than the last. Wow! You can turn them off if you want to destroy your immersion, you sensible human being! Because, let's be real, the left stick's the better option. No one's angry at you, I'm sorry for yelling. Tools of Destruction also introduces a new Raritanium upgrade system, which is... Yeah, okay, so what happens is that you collect these crystals, right? And then when you're at a vendor, you can use said crystals to upgrade specific stats for a weapon. This is, this is pretty bad. Staring at a menu, bumping up stats that may or may not be noticeable in gameplay, more numbers made obsolete when the weapon hits max level and it's on to the next one. I really don't get why we need to have this on top of the regular through-use system. It's like we wanted to rework upgrading weapons, but also didn't really, and now we're saddled with two underwhelming mechanics. 1/2 times 1/2 does not equal 1 whole. Also, I don't know if this stat stuff is part of it, but holy hell, this game's damage scaling is garbage. Why is everything so damn tanky? So many enemies in this game do stupid amounts of damage while also having stupid amounts of health, which can make this game feel like such a damn grind fest. I guess I could mitigate things a little bit by buying some armor, but have you seen the sets in this game? They're the grossest thing I've ever seen. I'm not besmirching my body with them. And I guess fair's fair, you can kinda cheat right back by constantly topping off health and ammo if there's a nearby vendor. So I guess we'll call this one a draw. Meanwhile, a Crack in Time's major new addition is a set of hover boots for Ratchet to use to speed around all fast, and yeah, they're pretty fun. Going commando and up your arsenal had something similar called charge boots, but the boost they gave was pretty fixed, making them awkward to use in normal gameplay. The hover boots allow for way more control over your movement, which is nice, but they require a few button inputs to activate and properly utilize, and you can't shoot while using them, so they kind of feel gimmicky and only really come into play when the game flat out tells you to use them. Or as a glide substitute, since Clank's not with Ratchet for most of the game, which I actually find kinda disappointing. Doesn't feel like we get much of a chance to let Clank's absence sink in through the gameplay, you know? Since we can get by just fine without him. No, Clank, you rest your weary propellers, really, it's fine, I'm good. Speak of the Robo-Boy, a Crack in Time also gives Clank gameplay a much-needed shot in the arm. Clank's been playable in every main series entry exempting Deadlocked, but his gameplay hasn't drastically changed since the first game, though how annoying they get varies per game. All his bits are slower, more careful platforming segments, revolving around commanding AI companion characters, but A Crack in Time pushes this into a really interesting new direction in the form of time puzzles. By interacting with these time pads, Clank can record up to a minute of his own actions, then have that recorded movement carried out by a holographic past Clank. You can have up to 4 Clanks at once running around with different pathing, pressing different switches, and navigating the environment to get the present Clank through the exit. These puzzles are really cool, really clever, and quite possibly my favorite bits of the entire game. They're solid brain ticklers, forcing you to think in terms of past, present, and future, as you play around what you've done to enable the next Clank to push further, sometimes having to re-record past pathing to allow one Clank to continue their business while you in the present set up for shenanigans past that point. When explained verbally, it sounds like an absolute muddle, but it's all intuitive in-game, and the puzzle layouts themselves are concise enough that scenarios never get overwhelming. They're fun, never frustrating, and never rely on anything but your own creative thinking to be solved. Finally, Clank gets a gameplay that's a fittingly cerebral juxtaposition to Ratchet's fighty action style, instead of just being slower to come off as smarter. Love to see it. Of course, I think it's easy to forget that these puzzles aren't the entirety of what you do as Clank in this game. In fact, they don't even make up the majority. Most of what you're going to be doing as Clank is really simple platforming and twatting things with a big stick, which I think we've mastered that, Insomniac. We've been doing this for 7 years at this point. Also, you can do this. Ooh. There are other little tricks sprinkled throughout the games. There are now dialogue options and conversations with NPCs. I'm not sure why, especially in Quest for Booty, in which it literally never matters or there's only one right option anyway, so why even bother giving us the choice? Magical land of not my problem. What the hell? Why would Ratchet even say this? What are we doing here? Meanwhile, A Crack in Time has some slight side questery through a somewhat elaborate space exploration setup. Pretty chill as far as optional stuff goes, but I wouldn't rate it as super exciting, cause it's all featureless moons and the like. And it's kind of annoying when your story progression gets arbitrarily cup-checked every now and then to make you hit a doodling around quota. Probably the best ship gameplay in the series, but it's not like that's a hotly contested field. There's also that handful of constructo weapons I kind of talked about before. You can customize with these different firing modes, ammo styles, that kind of thing. It's only 3 weapons, so it's pretty superfluous, but, kind of neat. Other than that, though, these games are pretty typical Ratchet fare, and I think that's part of what makes these games so much less remarkable to me. Put these games next to the PS2 ones, and that's about 7 years of basically the same gameplay. These future games pinched the cheeks of the formula, tousled the fringes, but didn't evolve or expand upon the core gameplay in any meaningful way. 7 years in, a whole new generation of hardware, best we can do is go through the same motions, and not even as well as we used to. To me, these games are fun, but ultimately fleeting. Without a strong narrative context or realized world building to make up for the lack of real innovation, so much of these games feel like style over substance that didn't actually add anything to the series, just made it prettier and more unnecessarily convoluted, and honestly, a lot blander. The weird thing is, though, had Insomniac actually lent into the older games instead of ignoring them for this weird quasi-soft reboot thing, they could have made something really special. You wouldn't even have to work that hard to make the connections to the previous tetralogy. Azimuth very stubbornly pursuing a single goal despite the risk of ignoring the bigger picture. Ratchet from the first game, anyone? Or thinking about themes like heritage when you have characters that literally come from nowhere, or were a mistake. Or even if they just lent more into some of the original ideas that came out of these future games. Imagine a full game styled after the Tomley Outpost or Gimlick Valley levels in A Crack in Time, in which you keep dipping into the past to change things up in the present to create a new way forward. Or maybe leaning more into the anomaly fixing thing, in which you can fix time anomalies to open up previously inaccessible secrets and areas. A little bit of A, a little bit of B, could have made for some really cool ways to interact with levels and shake up the classic Ratchet formula. But it seems like there was nothing scarier to Insomniac during this time than actually changing the classic Ratchet formula. I don't think it's any coincidence that this exact model of gameplay for these games was basically lifted directly out of the series' most acclaimed entry and virtually untouched across the whole series. It feels like there was more of a concern about Ratchet as a brand during this time, and when you think about it this way, the word sterilization comes to mind. By not making a point, the game doesn't run the risk of losing you or making you mad at it. By disconnecting from the previous game's plots, it's easier to have newer faces jump into the series. A bit of edge might turn some types off, but the kind of generic hero story we're working with here, wacky good time fun, it's appetizing to the broad majority. But in losing that edge, you lose any chance of digging into the skin, you know? You're not gonna leave any impression behind. It really wouldn't have taken much effort to have it both ways. Like I said, the connections are possible, they are there, just begging to be made. Just goes to show, if you're hyper-focused on external contexts and audience reactions, the story you're telling is gonna suffer without any meaning unto itself. The end results, an unfortunately tepid close to the PS3 escapades of a once proud duo. Unless... I feel like a lot of people don't remember this one, perhaps because it released in late 2013, literally days before the PlayStation 4. Hard to imagine how it got overshadowed. It's also not a very big game, being an epilogue of sorts to the future trilogy, but for being more of an after-dinner snack, a snack it is indeed. This is easily the best Ratchet game on PS3. The weirdly wonderful thing about Nexus is that despite being a third the size of the mainline future games, it actually does the classic formula more right than any of those games did. What's this? I could go this way? Or another? Wait, I think I remember, don't tell me. It's branching. Branching paths. Multiple destinations without clarity on which one's the right one. Villains that actually make you piss yourself. Thematic content? Excitement? I didn't think they had it in them, but they did it. They made another PS2-ass Ratchet game. Now, it's not just Nexus being more like a PS2 Ratchet game. It's part of it, but it's also how Nexus iterates and tweaks the formula in new ways that actually evolve the experience and curate a much finer feel. The default control scheme blends a happy medium between lock strafe and manual aiming, most notably by having firing focusing on where the camera is pointing instead of Ratchet's body. It's minor, but contributes to a much silkier flow by not having to micromanage Ratchet so much. Yes! Finally someone gets it! Controlling Ratchet in this game is so effortless. Be it in combat or in the platforming, you have complete freedom of laser-precise movement, leaving nothing flying in the face of your focus as you fight off flocks of felonious foes. Fun! The weapons you have to hand follow the same oopsies and poopsies as you'd find in the other games, but they have new twists on them that suit the game's decidedly horror-leaning tone. Like, instead of hypnotizing enemies with Disco Fever, LOL Random, you have the Nightmare Box that'll terrify any enemy in range, and I do mean any enemy. I love the way the final boss reacts to it. At first I thought the snowman gun was a little too off-kilter, but then I realized it's literally giving your enemies the chills. Don't know if that was intentional, but I thought it was pretty great. On the whole, your arsenal feels like it has a decent sense of thematic and aesthetic unity, which I think goes without saying the older games had in spades, while the future games never quite managed. The main new trick up Nexus's sleeve is gravity, most specifically realized through a gravity tether that can connect 2 points with a directional gravity well. Contextual as it might seem, the game actually makes good use of the mechanic through various environmental puzzles involving multiple wells and clever secrets for those willing to get creative with them, as well as the occasional intersection with the combat to make for some fun scenarios that actually change the odd enemy encounter. This is also the game that introduced the jetpack to the series. Not the reboot, this game. Perhaps the single best addition to the series in a decade, this game gave it to us. It's a jetpack. What do you want me to say? It's a jetpack. When has a jetpack ever not made a game 100 times cooler? Look at me, I'm flying around, big open levels, getting in dogfights, finding cool secrets. Friggin' jetpack, what do you need me for? It explains itself. Nexus even does the hover boots better than a crack in time. No more press the button, turn them on, then another go faster, turn the key. Do you want to use the hover boots? Then press the button to use the hover boots. Such a delectable degree of mobility and control pumping through combat that's both frantic and uniquely balletic, crossed with some simple but stylish physics puzzles. That's some good game. Meanwhile, Clank's levels have been entirely revamped. No longer 3D think-em-ups, Nexus's Clank segments are 2D platforming bits that let you switch the direction of gravity using the right stick, which many have compared to the style of indie hit VVV. They're probably the only example of Clank gameplay in the series that manages to maintain the rest of its game's brisk pace while also being distinct in and of itself, and I find them pretty fun. They're not so much puzzles, nor are they among the game's highlights, truthfully, but having to retrace your way through a labyrinthine stage you might have gotten through purely on reaction time alone, while an unstoppable monster chomps at your heels, it hits the right way. But as I seem to have implicitly tipped my hand towards the complain plate, I shall continue to tip further. While Nexus absolutely crushes the gameplay side of things, the rest of the package can sometimes be a bit pokey. For as strongly as the story starts with a well-paced and memorable introduction, a legitimately creepy atmosphere, fun character moments, and some neat mic drops, the game fumbles said mic come the end by stampeding towards a fairly tepid resolution. Ironically, it's when the game starts resembling a more typical Ratchet style and setting that it starts losing itself a bit. And as a de facto epilogue, the story's more into waxing reflexive than pushing out anything new. But at any rate, the story does better than the actual future games in that it shows a willingness to embrace previous game stories and comment on them instead of downright ignore them.
Can you imagine seeing your kind right there? Close enough to touch, but impossible to reach.
Yeah, not very subtly, but still. It makes this Ratchet feel a lot more realized as a character when his actual actionable past is re-examined and rationalized. And it makes the series feel that little bit more complete. A weary Ratchet breaking down into laughter at the ending speaks volumes as to where this game's head is at, and it's a nice place. Well, nice, until you meet the big bad guy. Look at this dude. He's straight up Bloodborne. Absolute unit, gone too soon. Relatedly, outside the aforementioned pacing problems, I don't know if I consider Nexus's length an inherent weak point. Like Deadlocked, the game's more limited space lends itself to a tighter focus and more appetizing replayability. But I'd say we're towing the line here on how many repeat visits we're expected for a mere 5-planet campaign. Without any grinding, it'll take partway through the third playthrough to get all your gear fully kitted, with most of it coming down to cobbling together Raritanium for some measly stat upgrades instead of anything more substantial or exciting. Oh yeah, the stat-based Raritanium upgrade system is back, as is the through-use system, Natch, but I'm actually not that down on either this time around. Weapons only go up to a 3rd level, with new Raritanium upgrades becoming available each level, which tips the scales just enough that it feels like it's the Raritanium stuff that matters more. And most of the weapons have upgrades available that allow them to earn more bolts, Raritanium, etc., which will obviously help you level up everything else faster, so overall it feels like there's more of a reason to keep using weapons after leveling them. Plus, the offered upgrades feel marginally more impactful in actually changing up the weapons as opposed to the proper future games, which were basically, look, it's blue now, woo! I'm not gonna pretend like I suddenly love these systems now, but something about the way Nexus handles them just works for me. Same middling meal, but at least a fair bit of unnecessary fat has been trimmed. There are a few things that the proper future games definitively have on this one, though. Being stuck with only one single save slot isn't very cash money, I tell you what, and the game only runs at 30 frames per second. And even if that means having to take a shower after every session with the game, it's a worthwhile price in my eyes. Into the Nexus manages to simultaneously call back to classic aspects of the original PS2 Ratchet games, while also pushing things forward to not only give itself a unique gameplay identity, but also polish the existing formula to an immaculate shine, making for one of the most singularly addictive experiences in the series behind maybe Deadlocked. Nexus doesn't feel like a Ratchet game that was made because the finance department said we needed a Ratchet game. It feels like a game made by people who wanted to make a game, and I feel like that's the big distinction. It's the quintessence of what makes the Ratchet series great, condensed in a lovely little shot. It could be longer, it could be more sharply dressed, it won't be what saves my marriage, but it's more proudly and definitively a solid conclusion to this series than the future games were. And the only truly bad thing I have to say about it is that this game coming out so late in the Ratchet series means I can't write off any other future games quite yet. Before you ask, yes, I did skip the spin-off games. There's really not much worth saying about either of these games, truthfully. All for One's a decent enough co-op game, I guess, but its mechanics are limited and its story pretty hokey, so it's a pretty easy skip-a-rooney. Meanwhile, Full Frontal Assault sucks. A tower defense game in which your defenses can't do shit. Where do I sign up? Yeah, I know it gave us the sublime control scheme that Nexus uses, but that's the only good thing about it. I can appreciate Insomniac actually trying new things and getting experimental, but, could have tried a little harder. That'd have been cool too, trying a little harder. But none of that matters, because literally days after Nexus, once again the Ratchet series faced another generational leap. With the promise of a sleek new console stubbornly against backwards compatibility, an opportunity was presented to slather the slate clean and retool Ratchet for a whole new next-gen crowd. How'd it go? I'm giving the game its own video, that's how it did go. So get ready for that in the next episode.